Hello and welcome to episode 17 of a Plain Accounts web series where every week we discuss at least one of that coming Sunday's lectionary texts. Today we are looking at Luke 24, the gospel reading for Easter Sunday. Here as usual is Ben Kramer. Ben, do you want to say hello?
Hello all.
And we are privileged to have with us today our contributor, the one who wrote our essay on a plain account this week for this passage, Dr. Richard Thompson. Dr. Thompson, say hello. Glad to have you here. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, Richard Thompson. I teach New Testament and Greek at Northwest Nazarene University. I'm chair of the Department of Religion.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a privilege to have you here.
Good to be here. Yeah, great to have this conversation.
Yeah, and if you haven't read Dr. Thompson's essay yet, you need to do it. In your preparation for preaching on Sunday, you need to read his essay. It was really important. It was a great essay. So do that. And let's go ahead and jump right into this. I'm going to read Luke 24, 1 through 12, and then we're going to discuss what we need to know about the text. We're going to exegete the text, and then we're going to kind of exegete our world, our culture, our society, and how we can be preaching this passage. So Luke 24, 1 through 12, as recorded in the New Revised Standard Version. But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they came to the tomb, taking the spices that they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb. But when they went in, they did not find the body. While they were perplexed about this, suddenly two men in dazzling clothes stood beside them. The women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground, but the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be handed over to sinners and be crucified, and on the third day rise again." Then they remembered his words, and returning from the tomb, they told all this to the 11 and to all the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them who told this to the apostles. But these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb. Stooping and looking in, he saw the linen cloths by themselves. Then he went home amazed at what had happened. The written word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Amen. So, okay, all the Gospels have the resurrection, right? What makes Luke's account different? What makes it important? What's happening here? What do we need to know about this resurrection story?
Yeah. Well, one of the first things I think, just in starting, is that when we read this account, just like with other gospel accounts, I think what often happens is that we read almost from the perspective of what I call the fifth gospel, a fifth gospel of our own perspective. And so one of the first things we need to somehow do is recognize, just as you mentioned well there, Danny, is that we need to recognize that Luke writes from his own perspective, and we need to start there and recognize what he is doing, and recognize also then that that what Luke is doing is very different from what Matthew's doing, what Mark is doing, and what John is doing. So, I think that's one of the first steps that that we have to do. Is that Luke is coming from a very different perspective, and that really comes from everything that's been going on in Luke's gospel. And so if persons have been preaching from the lectionary, then they've been looking at some of these other gospel texts from Luke even up to this point, and so drawing from that Luke has a particular understanding of salvation, that salvation is already here, so it's not just waiting until Easter, it's not waiting for the cross to occur for salvation to happen, but that salvation is already here. So we've even had it from the time of Jesus' birth. So Jesus was, when Jesus was born, the announcement was, "Today is born this day a Savior." So you have salvation, in very Lucan terms, and salvation even coming in the incarnation, in that respect. So you have this build up, in that respect. You have salvation to the disenfranchised. You have salvation to the most unlikely. All these sorts of things that are leading up to this. And so recognizing that literary context then in that respect, and that becomes, I think, a really important thing, right from the beginning, that that what we have then when we come to chapter 24, is going to be set up by what we've had through these first 23 chapters.
Read Luke and Luke, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So start there.
Right. So then what is Luke doing?
Yeah. So one of the things I mentioned then in my essay, for instance, is and something that I find just really fascinating then in terms of context is that the very last thing that Luke mentions before anything happens in chapter 24, and Luke is the only one who mentions this, is that before anything happens in chapter 24, Luke's the only one that mentions that the women, after Jesus' body had been laid into the tomb, the women rested according to the Sabbath, on that Black Saturday.
Right.
Which I really find fascinating. Luke's the only one who mentions that. We often don't know what to do on Saturday of Passion Week other than have Easter egg hunts. And yet, in the Gospels, Luke of all the others, tells this fascinating little tidbit, just this short little fragment of a sentence at the very end of the chapter, as far as what the women did. After their world had been turned upside down, when they didn't know what to do, when they didn't know where to turn, they did the only thing that I think they knew what to do, and that is they rested. In Hebrew, the term would be Shabbat, Sabbath, but they rested according to the commandment. So my read of that is they worshipped.
Right.
They did the only thing they knew what to do. And I think that's a wonderful setup then in terms of what happens when we don't really see, in some respects, some of the details, are very similar to what you find in the other Gospels. That setup, is extremely important for what we then see in chapter 24.
Right, and that was incredible to read in your commentary. That was very helpful and a very important word. And I would say very often in churches that I have attended in the past, Easter Sunday, the message is so often targeted at visitors, right? And there's this attempt at this come to Jesus moment. There's this kind of plea to do whatever you can to kind of bring them in. And I would say if you're going to be preaching to your visitors, preach verse 56 of chapter 23 as well as 24, 1 through 12. Because what you've said is they were able to see the resurrection. They were able to see the empty tomb because they had been in worship.
Mm-hmm.
Because they had been preparing themselves. They had been doing the thing that they knew to do despite the difficulty, despite the loss, despite how empty they were. They worshipped. They kept the commandment. And because of that, they are then the first ones to see the empty tomb.
Right.
They are the ones that these two men in dazzling clothes appear to.
Right.
Right.
And yet they didn't see themselves initially. They saw the evidence. They saw the empty tomb. They went inside, which is rather interesting because of course we don't in our 21st century images we we don't have this picture in our minds, but from the first century, picture of this small tomb where you can at least stoop down and walk inside, so you can see the empty tomb in that respect. And yet they saw the evidence and they didn't get it.
Right.
They didn't get it in that initial viewing, but it's then in that encounter with the two, where they're then told to remember.
Right.
And this isn't just a kind of remember with your mind. Remember in terms of your memory, although it is that.
It's
but
not
it's
just a
almost,
recollection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and but it's also this kind of recall that once it does come to your mind, then this becomes a part of who you are. And when you get it, then you're going to act upon it. It's very much like the Hebrew words for obey and to listen. To listen in that respect in terms of obedience and acting upon it, in that respect. And so and the fact that Luke, in that when the two men respond to them, they say, look, get this, and the root word for that is see, but it's not just see with your eyes, blepo, to see, but it's harao. This is harao in terms of get it, understand it.
Right.
In that respect.
How much are we supposed to see the two men representing Elijah and Moses? Because when you hear them say look and see, it kind of combines with this whole law and the prophets hanging off of the commandment that is so embodied in Jesus and then ushered in and finalized through the resurrection. But Luke doesn't give us any clear indication of who these two people are, but my mind couldn't help but go back to the Transfiguration when we saw these two men standing next to Jesus.
Well, and it's the same Greek, too, that describes them.
Yeah,
the two men, it's the same Greek, and then Jesus was dazzling at the Transfiguration, and now where Jesus is empty in the tomb, the two men are now dazzling. So,
yeah, and and if we flash forward then to the Ascension, you have once again two men, and so it's interesting these three key scenes, in the Transfiguration, at the Resurrection, and the Ascension. It's interesting that for Luke you have these two men, and so while it's Luke isn't terribly clear, the fact that in the first instance he does mention Moses and Elijah. Most interpreters suggest that there seems to be that that kind of connection. And later on in chapter 24, when Jesus appears to the two, I believe a man and wife, a couple, on their way to Emmaus, when Jesus then explains, about this is to fulfill, regarding the law and the prophets. It goes along with that, that theme as well. So, so over and over again, you have this connection, that that this is fulfillment of the law and the prophets, and not in a kind of literalistic sense, but this is a shorthand way of saying, these are the purposes of God, being fulfilled, in that sense. So, very much so.
and if I can maybe take a step backwards and think about the remembering aspect of this, that remembrance is way more than just this mental recollection. But it seems to me, as I've been kind of reflecting on this passage, typically when we remember events, I don't know, I watched the series Making a Murderer, and it's all on Netflix, and this crazy cult following TV show about what happened, and everybody's remembering what happened, but they remember it so differently. And it seems that like when we remember things, our mind fills in the blanks in weird ways. We don't our memory is kind of clouded when we remember things, but not for Luke. Not according to Luke. What Luke says is that if you want to understand, remember what Jesus told you. These two men are saying, he said this was going to happen. Don't you remember? And that remembering Christ provides clarity. Remembering the words that Christ has spoken in the past provides sight. We can look. We can see. We can perceive. We can obey. We can do these things because Christ. So while our typical memory leads us to really weird things, apparently Luke says remembering the words of Christ, remembering what Jesus has done and what Jesus has said, allows us to see better than we did before.
And that goes along, if you go all the way back to the preface of Luke's Gospel. He talks about, I write these things so that you may be certain of the things that you've been taught. Many times people will say, "Oh, aha!" He's trying to write this kind of exact account in terms of this is exactly what happened. But there's a sense in which there is this remembering that's happening. Now that's and in that respect, is there history going on? Of course there is. But his concern is that in the remembering, and again, in remembering, it is not just telling the story, but it's also telling the story in ways where you then also live it out, and respond in particular ways. And that is, there is something about being truthful, in that retelling, which is not unlike, what you find if we go back to the Old Testament. You remember in Deuteronomy 6 with the Shema.
Right.
You have the love the Lord your God passage, but then there is why do we have these monuments? And then it's tell them then the stories of how the Lord delivered you out of Egypt. Tell them how the Lord did this. Tell them why we have these commandments, why we have this covenant. And it's and in that sense, then there is this remember by telling.
Right.
And being faithful then by living out and and that faithfulness then in that ongoing that ongoingness in passing on to the next generation.
Right. And
so something very similar.
Yeah. Well, okay. That's huge. And maybe a few more things before we jump into how we preach this text, because that's a big conversation as well. A few things that I think maybe to look at. One of the things that I think is incredibly important is to recognize the role that these women play. Mary Magdalene is present in all four Gospels. She's the only one who's present at the tomb in a consistent way in all four of the Gospels. But the first ones that hear the announcement that the tomb is empty and that Jesus is no longer dead is to these women. And then what do? They run and they tell the 11 and those who were with them, right? And to all the rest, whoever those rest were. And so the first preachers of the resurrection were these women. Were it not for the preaching of women, the resurrection message wouldn't have been spread as it was. And so I think it's incredibly important that we recognize the role that these women play in the preaching of the good news. And then I think something else we look at is what the men thought of when they heard these women. It seemed to them an idle tale. And that the Greek here is leros, which is where it was a medical term, and it's where we get our word delirious. The men thought these women were out of their minds. Because what are the two things that we're sure of in life, and we're all aware of it right now, right? Death and taxes, right? But Jesus doesn't even let that alone. Even this thing that we're so sure of, death, Jesus doesn't let it happen. But the men thought they were crazy. They were delirious. They were delusional. Surely there's something wrong with them. And so that's something interesting to look at.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things is that in the midst of the women, being seen, and you're exactly right, that they were seen as spouting a bunch of nonsense. I do find it interesting that the one who did respond, was the one who typically, was the one with the foot and mouth disease.
Right.
And yet Peter is the one who then ran, and checked things out. Didn't know what to do with it.
Right.
But it is fascinating to me that of all who didn't respond, Peter ended up being the one who did.
Right.
And in that respect, then, in at least Luke's account, then, of when Peter then takes center stage, then for the first part of the book of Acts, that his ministry ends up being, he owes that to the women.
Right.
Which is also fascinating then too. This is really the last major role, in many respects, for women in Luke and Acts. Surprisingly, in the book of Acts, women, although being in Acts 2, where it says young men and young women will prophesy, they never do.
Yeah.
Which becomes a real problem for Luke and Acts. That there's a big shift. In that. But their testimony, as you rightly note, if it's not for them, according to Luke, the gospel doesn't go forward.
Right.
It's interesting that an interesting observation that St. Augustine points out in this text is that you have kind of the opposite narrative of the garden taking place, where you have a woman coming with deceit from the serpent to a man, and he believes her completely and goes right along with it, kind of a silent observer. And then here you have women bringing the truth and wisdom to these people, and they reject it. They don't follow along blindly. They think that they are out of their mind. And so you see this really interesting exchange here taking place with humanity rejecting truth, but will so easily accept people who are out of their minds. So they will so easily accept that deception because it seems to be much more appealing in line with what they already believe, rather than allowing God to come in and shape what they are to believe about this circumstance. So that's a really interesting exchange there as we continue to look forward on into Luke and Acts.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So in our last 10 minutes or so, let's kind of shift, if we can, kind of giving a bunch of context, historical, literary, theologically. Mm-hmm. What do we do with it? How do we preach it? What are some homiletical handles? How are ways we can make this appropriate and apprehendable to our congregations on this greatest of Sundays?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things is that the women. The women are able to see resurrection because of their, I think their preparation, due to worship.
Yeah.
And they're able to see resurrection in the midst of, literally the death around them. The circumstances around them that perhaps suggest otherwise. And so so this is a passage that talks about, as I mentioned in my essay, about being able to see differently, and to and to to live life in terms of resurrection, and that comes not only out of worship, but but living this kind of resurrection life, in that sort of way. But it begins with this kind of this perspective that that comes out of the context of of worship. I think that's one of the first things that comes out of this. That comes out of the context that Luke provides. That's one of the first things that we've already talked about that a bit. But
yeah.
One of the things I want to emphasize in my sermon is we've been looking at the ways in which Luke plays with distance and nearness all throughout his gospel. We see while the prodigal son was still yet far off, the father was filled with compassion and ran to him. And you see this sort of distance and nearness again show up in chapter 24, where what just strikes me about this chapter is that the star of the show is not there. Like, he's resurrected, but where is he? Like, we need to see him. We need to be near him. Again, it feels like Jesus is distant, but then the law and the prophets then remind us through Elijah and Moses that what are you remembering? How are you going to remember this event? And that is the state of the church today, is we gather to remember and remember faithfully who Jesus is and what he's called us to. And even especially in the times where he feels far off, where he feels distance, we need to be near to remembering him rightly. We need to be faithful in our memory so that we can participate in a God who's near, but we may not be understanding it because of our own convictions are getting in the way. Our own perspectives are clouding that. So we need to be faithful to remember rightly and gathering in worship. And it all ties back to that verse 56 in 23. We need to be in worship so that we can remember his words rightly and be near to Christ because his kingdom has come near, as Luke adamantly suggests throughout his gospel.
Now, Ben, something you just said, I have maybe a question for you, Dr. Thompson. If you, in your, I don't know, our chapter and verses were later additions, obviously, to the original texts. But within the text, you can see these section breaks that are apparent. Mm-hmm. It seems to me, could it be that 56b is the beginning of a new section? 23:56b, on the Sabbath they rested according to the commandment, because the next sentence is, but on the first day of the week. Could that be kind of one long thought that you're supposed to see on the first day of the week at early dawn? That's connected to the previous day of Sabbath rest. Could our breakdown be a bit inappropriate in this way?
Yeah. Now, what's interesting is in the Greek text I have before me, they actually have 56b connected to the paragraphs of chapter 24, which makes that tie-in wonderfully, makes that connection very well, in respect. And so, so in that respect, our chapter breaks actually betray us, in that respect.
Yeah.
I think another thing too, with this whole idea of remembering, I think a couple of other connections that that can also be made. One is the various words for tomb, also have the same root word. And I put the Greek in, with the essay to try and at least show that the tombs literally are remembering places, memorials, and so you have kind of this irony of what's taking place in terms of remembering. You have the irony of the tomb itself not stimulating that, and yet it is a remembering kind of place. But But another thing too is that I think Luke's account of the Last Supper is the only account that also talks about do this in remembrance of me. And so so there's another instance of this is a remembering time. And so this possibility of connecting the dots in Luke's gospel in terms of what it means to remember, so that so that as you think about the two men talking about remember what Jesus said and remember what Jesus talked about. One of the last things that Jesus also said about remembering, was what he did, in breaking bread, and giving it to them, which is rather interesting then, because later on in the chapter is when he also breaks bread with the couple,
Right.
and gives it to him, which I think is also a fascinating passage because I, myself in interpretation don't see that as a Eucharistic event per se in terms of the discovery, but it's it's fascinating there that when he hands the bread to them, it's in the giving that they recognize.
Right.
And it's so I think it's when he stretches out his hands that they first recognize in that respect. And I think that provoked another remembering.
Right.
And that. So you have all these different instances where I think in terms of preaching, someone can tie selectively these different moments of remembering that are a part of Luke's gospel. Depending on what particular idea someone would want to utilize.
Right. Well, that's beautiful too. That connecting all those different ways of remembering, or those different instances of it within the text. One thing I think I'm wanting to do this Sunday with my people, with my congregation, is to kind of give them permission to wrestle with it. So often the resurrection is a given, right? And obviously we're Christians because of the resurrection, right? This is, I mean.
Yeah.
This is it, right? I mean, this is the most important Sunday. But what do the women do when they get there? The thing they expect to happen is not there. They expect to see a dead body, and they don't know what to do. And Peter, but then they have the two men to describe it to them. But then Peter goes to the tomb, and it doesn't say he comes to acknowledge the resurrection. It says, and then he went home amazed at what had happened. It was this, there's no conclusion here, and it takes some time for people to get it. And so I want to give my people permission to say, what? This is real. I want to give them space to wrestle with the resurrection. And then in the coming weeks, we see in Eastertide, to see Easter as this season, not just this one day, we see how the church has come to faith in the resurrection. And it's okay to wrestle with it. But, and I think, Ben, this is where your word is so good here, but we draw near to God, not having that distance. We draw near to him in the midst of our wrestle, like, as you've said, Dr. Thompson, like the women did on Holy Saturday, on Shabbat, on Sabbath. They worshipped in the midst of their darkness, in the midst of their struggle. And so we remember through worship. We not just recollect, but we embody in some way the resurrection of Christ in our worship. And so I want to say maybe it's okay if we say, what is going on? Because those disciples said that.
Well, and the women themselves, they walked
perplexed,
and they didn't get it.
Right.
Yeah.
They didn't. and if it weren't for the two, who took them a step further, they wouldn't have gotten it either. Now they did because of that. But I like where you're going with that, Danny, because you've got, in essence, you have multiple responses, within the text. And so another way that someone could go with it is looking at the various responses and saying, what, it's okay. You may be like the women pre-encounter with the two. You may be like the women after remembering. You may be like Peter. Or if someone wanted to go further, you may be like the two, and I haven't looked further to see if the next week's lectionary text is, on 13:35. If so, that's a wonderful thing for the following week.
Right.
How many times are we like the couple on the road to Emmaus? But there's these different kinds of responses.
Right.
To the resurrection, in that respect.
Yeah.
And it's okay to wrestle. That's also the nature of resurrection, in that respect. But being able to, in the midst of remembering, to at the same time, as the women, doing what they still know to do, that that doesn't negate the presence of God, and going back to God when oftentimes people almost think that there's only door number one and door number two. You either have to trust God completely and accept everything, or you chuck it all.
Right.
When in reality, there's all kinds of room in the middle, where God can meet us where we are in the midst of the confusion and not knowing what just happened here.
Right.
But still being able to put one foot in front of the other and knowing that, that I can still worship God when I don't understand, and you fill in the blank.
Right. Yeah, what a good word. This is such an important Sunday, obviously. Easter Sunday, the most important Sunday of the year, in my opinion. And what a great text that we have to preach from. And we've had a great commentary written on it, a great preaching resource written on it this week at A Plain Account. So thank you so much, Dr. Thompson, for writing this week and for joining us today. It's an honor, it's a privilege to be able to discuss this with you. It's informed how I will be preaching this Sunday. My hope is that for our viewers, it will do the same. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, it's been fun.
And Ben, any final word before we close our episode?
My mind has just been sent reeling with all the different important messages that this Sunday will have. We will start our services, I'm sure, with "He has risen," in a past tense. And how are we to remember and hold on to the fact that He has risen and be faithful in our remembrance as He is faithful to us? I couldn't help but think of the old woman in front of the judge, the parable that Jesus told his disciples, where he said, the old woman, she was persistent in prayer, so be consistent in prayer. And verse 8 comes along in that chapter and says, God's faithful, are you going to be? And it's kind of the same sort of message that we get here. And Luke is so good with cliffhangers. We get to the end of the fig tree, and it's like, wait another year. What happened? We get to the end of the parable of the prodigal son, and we're kind of left with what sort of reconciliation is going to take place between the sons and the father. We don't know, and we get a cliffhanger here as well at the empty tomb. Are they going to remember that? Are we just going to be amazed or are we going to walk forward in faithful remembrance of the resurrection? And that's really where the rubber meets the road. We've got to be faithful and consistent in our remembrance of Christ and what he said if we hope to embody it and not just give lip service to it. We don't want to be just close to God in our mouths and our lips, but we need to be close in our bodies and our hearts as well. Love the Lord with all your heart, soul, strength, and being, in mind, and doing that in a faithful remembrance.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, preachers, preach well this Resurrection Sunday. Preach the truth that he is risen and that death no longer holds him. What a great thing this is. And preach through the season of Eastertide. Resurrection it's not just limited to Easter. Preach the resurrection and preach boldly. Make sure that you subscribe to our YouTube channel, like our page on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, follow us on Instagram. We have incredible content coming out every week in order to help you preach well through the lectionary year. So thank you for joining us today. Ben, great to be with you, as always. And Dr. Thompson, so wonderful to have you joining us today. Thank you once again.
Great to be here. Thanks.
All right, go in peace.
And also with you.